Welcome to 221B Baker Street.
Chapter 1. The silence of the blizzard, the winter of 1088, descended upon London with a ferocity that seemed intent on stifling the very breath of the city. By mid-December, a relentless, powdery snow had blanketed the metropolis, muffling the usual clatter of hansom cabs and the cries of newsboys. London had become a ghost of itself, a white, silent world where the yellow glow of gaslight struggled to pierce the swirling crystalline veil. Inside the familiar sanctuary of 221B Baker Street, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the biting chill outside. A coal fire roared in the grate, casting long, dancing shadows across the rows of chemistry flasks and the cluttered bookshelves that defined my friend's eccentric domain. Sherlock Holmes sat in his high-backed armchair, his thin, aquiline features illuminated by the hearth glow. He was currently absorbed in the microscopic examination of a charred fragment of parchment, his long, nervous fingers wielding a magnifying glass with the precision of a surgeon. I sat opposite him, nursing a tin of tobacco and a deep sense of contentment. The cozy nature of our quarters was never more apparent than when a gale rattled the window panes. "I see, Watson," Holmes remarked suddenly, without lifting his gaze from the specimen, "that you found the walk to the post office this morning more treacherous than you anticipated. A pity about the left boot. The stitching in the welt is always the first to go when soaked in slush." I stared at him in genuine surprise. I had, indeed, ventured out an hour earlier to dispatch a letter to my old billiard mate, Thurston, and had suffered a most undignified slip on the icy pavement. "How on earth could you know that?" I asked. I changed my footwear the moment I returned and placed the wet pair in the scullery. Holmes chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "My dear doctor, you forget that the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. You are currently favoring your right side in that chair. Furthermore, there is a distinct, circular smudge of salt-treated slush on the inner hem of your trouser leg, a mark that could only be made if your left foot had slid inward at a sharp angle while the right remained stationary. As for the stitching, you have been glancing toward the hallway with a look of annoyance every time the wind whistles through the door gap, subconsciously mourning the loss of your favorite walking boots." I laughed, shaking my head. "It is a small thing, Holmes, but your logic is as unerring as ever." "It is a trifle," he said, finally setting down his glass and leaning back. His grey eyes, usually sharp and piercing, seemed to reflect the restless energy of a man starved for intellectual stimulation. "But in this weather, Watson, trifles are all I have. The criminal classes have apparently gone into hibernation. London is too cold for even the most desperate footpad." He had barely finished the sentence when the rhythmic thud of the heavy brass knocker echoed from downstairs. We heard the muffled voice of Mrs. Hudson, followed by the sound of laboured breathing ascending the stairs. The door opened to reveal a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very ice outside. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, but his face was haggard and drawn. His heavy greatcoat was caked in white, and his hands, which clutched a sodden felt hat, were trembling violently. "Mr. Holmes?" the man gasped, his breath misting in the warm room. "I am Arthur Pendergast. I have come from the estate of the Earl of Morley. A terrible thing has happened, sir. Something that defies the very laws of nature." Holmes rose, his boredom vanishing instantly like mist before the sun. He steered the young man toward the fire and poured him a generous measure of brandy. "Drink this, Mr. Pendergast," Holmes said firmly. "And then, pray, tell us of this supernatural occurrence. In my experience, laws of nature are rarely defied, though they are frequently misunderstood." The young man gulped the spirits, a bit of colour returning to his waxy cheeks. He looked at us with wide, haunted eyes. "It is about the Gospel of St. Jude, Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The illuminated manuscript that has been the pride of the Morley Library for 3 centuries. Last night, in the middle of the blizzard, a page was stolen from the heart of the volume." "A theft?" I interjected. "Surely that is a matter for the police." "You don't understand," Pendergast cried, leaning forward. "The library is a detached wing of the manor, surrounded by a courtyard of fresh, pristine snow. From the moment the storm began at 8 o'clock last night, Until the discovery at dawn, not a single soul entered or left that building. The snow around the library is as smooth as a sheet of paper, untouched, unmarked, silent. And yet, the page is gone, and the heavy iron doors were locked from the inside. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes glinting. A locked room, a stolen treasure, and a field of whispering snow that tells no tales. "Tell me, Mr. Pendergast, was anything else heard?" The young man shuddered. "The night watchman swears he heard it, sir." A faint, rhythmic scratching, like a pen moving across parchment, coming from inside the empty library. But when he looked through the frosted glass, he saw only the shadows of the blizzard dancing on the walls. Holmes turned to me, a thin, enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "It seems, Watson, that the winter has brought us something far more interesting than a broken boot welt. Pack your sturdiest coat. We go to Morley Manor." Chapter 2. The crimson stain on the alabaster. The journey to the outskirts of Surrey was a sombre affair. We travelled by the early afternoon train from Victoria Station, the locomotive's rhythmic chugging sounding like a labouring heart against the oppressive silence of the frost-bound countryside. Holmes remained ensconced in his corner of the first-class carriage, his chin sunk upon his chest and his deerstalker pulled low over his eyes. To the casual observer, he might have seemed asleep, but the slight, rhythmic twitching of his long fingers told me that his mind was racing through 1,000 possibilities, discarding theories as quickly as the telegraph poles whipped past our window. "The Morley family, Watson," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the hiss of the heater, "is one of the oldest and, until recently, most stable lineages in the south of England. The current Earl is a man of rigid habiter-collector of antiquities who values his library more than his lineage. The Gospel of St. Jude is not merely a book, it is a relic of the 9th century, shimmering with gold leaf and lapis lazuli. To steal a single page is not the act of a common thief. It is the act of a specialist, or perhaps a madman." "But the snow, Holmes," I argued, clutching my medical bag. Pendergast was adamant. "The library is a standalone structure. If no one crossed that courtyard, then the thief must have been inside all along. Or they departed by means that do not involve the terrestrial soil," Holmes remarked enigmatically. "However, I prefer to keep my feet on the ground until the facts force me into the air." We reached the Morley estate as the sun began its pale winter descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the drifts. Morley Manor was a gaunt, sprawling edifice of grey stone, its ivy-choked walls now draped in heavy white shrouds. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress guarding a secret. We were met at the iron gates by the Earl himself. Lord Morley was a tall, skeletal figure with a face like parchment and eyes that burned with a mixture of grief and indignation. He led us through the echoing great hall to a set of tall French windows that looked out upon the inner courtyard. "There it is, Mr. Holmes," the Earl whispered, pointing a trembling finger. "The impossible stage of a devilish play." Before us lay a perfectly square courtyard, perhaps 50 feet across. In the centre stood the Libraria Magnificent, octagonal stone building connected to the main house only by a narrow roofed stone walkway. The snow lay thick and undisturbed across every inch of the courtyard, a pristine sheet of alabaster that reflected the dying light. There was not a footprint, not a drag mark, not even the disturbance of a fallen branch. It was as smooth as a fresh-laid tombstone. "And the walkway?" Holmes asked, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "Bolted from this side at 10 last night," the Earl replied. The night watchman, a man named Miller, was stationed in the hall behind us. He had a clear view of the walkway. "The only other entrance to the library is the heavy oak door on its far side, facing the courtyard. Miller checked it at midnight, looking through these very windows. The snow was already deep, and it was untouched. This morning it remained the same." Holmes stepped out onto the walkway, his movements cat-like and precise. I followed closely, careful not to disturb the Earl's sense of order. When we reached the heavy iron-studded door of the library, Holmes did not immediately enter. Instead, he knelt, his nose inches from the stone threshold where the masonry met the snow. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The snow has drifted slightly against the wood, yet the seal is unbroken. If this door had opened, even an inch, the crust of the drift would have crumbled. "Watson, look here." I leaned down. Near the base of the door, where the white snow met the grey stone, was a tiny, singular blemish. It was no larger than a shillinga-bright, vivid spot of crimson that stood out with startling clarity against the white. "Blood?" I whispered, my professional instincts surfacing. Holmes touched it with a gloved finger and brought it to his face. He sniffed it, then tasted it with the tip of his tongue, a habit that always made me shudder. "Not blood, Watson. Cochineal ink. Specifically, the type used by medieval monks for the illumination of capital letters. It is fresher as fresh as the cold will allow, and yet..." He looked out at the vast, empty expanse of the courtyard. "The ink is here on the outside of the door, while the book sits in its glass case within. The page is gone, the thief is gone, and the snow remains a silent witness to nothing." He stood up, his eyes bright with a predatory light. "Lord Morley," Holmes called out, "I should like to examine the manuscript itself. And I should like to speak with your watchman. It appears we are dealing with a thief who either has the wings of a bird or the transparency of a ghost. Personally, I suspect neither." As we stepped into the chilling silence of the library, I looked back at that single red stain. It looked like a drop of blood on a shroud, a lonely clue in a world of white that refused to speak. Chapter 3, The Watchman's Phantom. The interior of the Morley Library was a cathedral to the written word. Octagonal in shape, its walls were lined from floor to vaulted ceiling with dark oak shelves, housing leather-bound volumes that exhaled the dry, vanilla-sweet scent of aging paper. A central pillar of carved stone supported the roof, and beneath a magnificent stained-glass window sat the altar of the room. A heavy, velvet-lined display case of reinforced glass and brass. It was here that the Gospel of St. Jude had rested for centuries. Now, the case stood open lock unpicked, the glass unmarred. The manuscript itself lay like a wounded bird, its heavy vellum pages fanned out. Where once had been a masterpiece of 9th-century illumination, there was now a jagged, painful gap. The page containing the benediction of the lost had been excised with a precision that suggested a steady hand and a very sharp blade. Holmes did not immediately approach the book. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, his head tilted, inhaling deeply. "Do you smell it, Watson?" he whispered. I sniffed the air. Old paper? Dust. The lingering chill of the stone. "Aniseed," Holmes muttered, his eyes darting toward the high, narrow ventilation slits near the ceiling. Faint, but unmistakable. A curious scent for a medieval library. He then turned his attention to the watchman, Miller, who had been summoned by the Earl. Miller was a stout, elderly man with the weathered face of a retired sailor and hands that could not stop kneading his baize apron. He looked thoroughly unnerved, his eyes darting toward the dark corners of the room as if expecting a spectre to emerge from the shadows. "Now, Miller," Holmes began, his tone uncharacteristically gentle, "tell us of the scratching you heard. Be precise. Was it the sound of a quill on paper, or perhaps a claw on stone?" Miller swallowed hard. It was rhythmic, Mr. Holmes, like a heartbeat, but sharper, scratch, pause, scratch. I was stationed at the end of the stone walkway, looking through the glass panes of the connecting door. The library was dark, save for the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. I heard it quite clearly over the wind. "And you saw no one?" "Not a soul, sir. I swear by all that is holy." I took my lantern and peered through the glass. I could see the display case in the center. I saw a shadow, a tall, spindly thing move across the far wall. It didn't walk, it seemed to glide, like a ghost made of smoke. I rushed to get the keys, but by the time I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the room was empty. The snow outside was as smooth as a fresh sheet, and the windows are all barred and bolted from within. Holmes paced the length of the room, his eyes fixed on the floor. He stopped at the central stone pillar and examined a small circular iron grate at its bassi, a Victorian addition for the circulation of warm air from the manor's furnace. "You say you saw a spindly shadow, Miller. Did it have a head, limbs?" "It was just a shape, sir, like a long finger wagging at me from the dark. And the scratching, it stopped the moment I turned the key in the lock." "Tell me," Holmes said, pausing his pacing, "does anyone else have access to the library? A scholar? A relative?" The Earl, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward. "Only my nephew, Julian. He is a student of hagiography at Oxford. He arrived 2 days ago to study the manuscript for his thesis. But he was in the drawing room with me and my daughter, Clara, until midnight. We were playing whist. The servants can attest to it." "I see," Holmes remarked. He knelt by the display case, examining the hinges. "And where is Mr. Julian now?" "He is in the morning room, quite distraught. He feels the loss of the page is a personal blow to his research." Holmes rose, his face a mask of inscrutable calm. He had found something on the floor near the central pillar, a tiny, translucent filament that he carefully tucked into his pocketbook. "Watson," he said, turning to me, "the problem of the snow is a delightful one. If a man cannot walk across it, and he cannot fly over it, we must consider if he was ever truly outside at Alor, if the outside we see is merely an illusion." "But the snow is real enough, Holmes," I protested. I nearly froze my ears off standing in the courtyard. "Oh, the snow is real," Holmes replied, a spark of genuine excitement in his eyes. "But the Phantom Miller saw, that, I think, was a masterpiece of mechanical theatre. Come, let us meet this scholarly nephew. I find that when a man is distraught over a theft, he is either a victim of a great loss or a very talented actor." As we left the library, Holmes paused at the red stain on the threshold once more. He didn't look at the stain, however. He looked at the roofline of the main manor, where a row of heavy icicles hung like jagged teeth, dripping slowly in the pale afternoon sun. "A mystery in white and red, Watson," he murmured. "And the answer, I suspect, lies in the things we cannot see precisely because they are right in front of our eyes." Chapter 4. The Scholar and the Shadow. The morning room of Morley Manor was a bright, airy chamber, though the pervasive chill of the blizzard seemed to have seeped through its heavy velvet curtains. A silver tea service sat untouched on a low mahogany table, the steam from the pot long since vanished. In a chair by the window sat Julian Pendergast, the Earl's nephew. He was a man of perhaps 30, with a high intellectual forehead and a nervous habit of smoothing his already immaculate fair hair. Beside him stood the Lady Clara, the Earl's daughter. She was a striking woman with a firm jaw and eyes that possessed a keen, searching quality that reminded me of Holmes himself. "Mr. Holmes," Julian said, rising with a sudden, jerky movement as we entered, "I cannot tell you what a catastrophe this is. The benediction of the lost is unique. There are scholars in Rome and Paris who would give their lives for a single hour with that page. And what of its value to a collector, Mr. Pendergast?" Holmes asked, his eyes sweeping the room with a practiced, predatory speed. "Say, one who did not care for hagiography, but possessed a deep appreciation for rare gold-leaf illumination." Julian's face paled. "It is priceless. On the black market, thousands of pounds. But who could have taken it? The library was sealed. You were playing whist last night, I understand," Holmes remarked, strolling toward a writing desk in the corner. "From 8 o'clock until midnight." "That is correct," Lady Clara replied, her voice steady and resonant. "My father, Julian, myself, and the butler, Graves. We were in the drawing room the entire evening. We could see the courtyard through the glass doors. The snow fell without a moment's pause." "And did any of you leave the room?" "Only Julian," she said, glancing at her cousin. "He stepped out for 10 minutes around 11 o'clock to fetch a fresh deck of cards from the Librarieth small library here in the house, I mean. He returned almost immediately." Holmes picked up a quill from the writing desk and examined the nib. "I see you are a diligent student, Mr. Pendergast. Your notes on the 9th century are extensive. But I notice a curious thing." "What is that?" Julian asked, his voice tightening. "You have a bottle of aniseed oil in your desk drawer," Holmes said, pointing to a small green vial tucked behind a stack of parchment. "A common remedy for a cough, perhaps, or a digestive aid." Julian blinked, looking confused. It is for my throat, Mr. Holmes. The winter air is quite harsh." "Naturally," Holmes murmured. He turned back to Lady Clara. "Tell me, Lady Clara, did you notice anything unusual during your game? A sound, a flicker of light?" "Nothing but the wind," she said. "However, I did notice that the shadows in the courtyard seemed active. At one point, I thought I saw a shape near the library roof, but when I looked again, It was gone. I dismissed it as the play of the blizzard. Holmes' eyes flashed with interest. He moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard once more. From this angle, the library's octagonal roof was clearly visible. The heavy icicles I had noticed earlier were still there, but Holmes was looking higher, at the very peak of the stone structure. The spindly shadow Miller saw, Holmes mused, the rhythmic scratching, and a drop of cochineal ink on the outside of a locked door. It is a beautiful puzzle, Watson. The pieces are all there, yet they seem to belong to different pictures. He suddenly turned to Julian. "Mr. Pendergast, may I see the boots you were wearing last night?" Julian looked affronted. "My boots? What could they possibly precision, man?" "Precision is the soul of science," Holmes snapped. Julian sighed and led us to the cloakroom. He produced a pair of sturdy, leather walking boots. Holmes knelt, examining the soles with his magnifying glass. He then stood up, a look of profound disappointment crossing his face. "Clean," he muttered. "Not a trace of the red ink, nor a single grain of the stone dust from the library floor." "I told you, Mr. Holmes," Julian said with a touch of petulance. "I never went near the library last night." "No one did, and yet the page is gone," Holmes said softly. As we walked back toward the hall, Holmes leaned toward me, his voice a mere breath. "Watson, did you notice the Lady Clara's hands?" "Her hands?" "She was wearing lace gloves, Holmes." "Exactly. Why wear gloves in a heated morning room while taking tea? And did you notice the slight stiffness in her left shoulder? She moved as if she were carrying a weight she wasn't accustomed to." "You suspect the daughter?" I whispered, shocked. "But she was at the card table." "I suspect everyone, Watson. In a house where the impossible has happened, the impossible usually turns out to be a very clever lie. And there is one person in this house who has not yet told us their version of the truth." "Who?" "The shadow on the roof," Holmes replied. He stopped at the foot of the great staircase, his gaze fixed on the heavy oak rafters above. "We must return to the library, Watson. I need to have a word with a certain iron grate. It has been far too silent for my liking." Chapter 5. The song of the ventilation shaft. The library felt colder upon our return, the silence more profound. The pale winter sun had dipped below the horizon, and the room was now illuminated only by the flickering lanterns we carried. The shadows of the bookshelves stretched across the floor like elongated fingers, reaching for the empty display case at the center. Holmes did not return to the manuscript. Instead, he moved directly to the central stone pillar I had noted earlier. He knelt by the iron grate at its Bassett intake for the manor's central heating system. With a flick of his pocket knife, he unscrewed the decorative brass housing, revealing the dark, yawning mouth of a stone-lined shaft. "Listen, Watson," he whispered, gesturing for me to join him on the cold floor. I leaned in, my ear near the opening. At first, I heard only the distant, mournful howl of the wind outside. But as I focused, a different sound emerged, a rhythmic, metallic tink-tink-tink, followed by a soft, whistling sigh. It was a mournful, melodic vibration that seemed to pulse through the very bones of the building. "The song of the shaft," Holmes murmured, "a draught created by the temperature differential between the heated manor and this frigid library. But there is more. Look at the edges of the stonework." He held his lantern close. The interior of the shaft was remarkably clean, save for a series of faint, vertical scores in the soot and dust. They were perfectly parallel, as if something with sharp edges had been lowered and raised repeatedly. "You mentioned a translucent filament earlier, Holmes," I said, remembering the prize he had tucked into his pocketbook. "Was it from here?" "Indeed. A strand of high-quality catgut, such as one might find on a violiner, a sophisticated mechanical pulley," he replied. "Now, Watson, consider the aniseed. It is a potent scent, often used by hunters to mask their own odor or, more interestingly, to draw a trained animal to a specific location." "A trained animal?" I exclaimed. "You think a creature was sent down this shaft to steal a priceless medieval page?" "A creature, or perhaps a more elegant solution," Holmes said, standing up and brushing the dust from his knees. "Consider the spindly shadow Miller saw. He described it as a long finger wagging in the dark. If one were to lower a weighted, articulated rod through a ventilation slit in the roof-one equipped with a delicate adhesive, or a set of fine pincer-sewn could operate it from the exterior without ever setting foot in the room. "But the roof is 30 feet high," I protested, "and the courtyard is a field of untouched snow. How could anyone reach the roof without leaving a trail?" Holmes walked to the window and stared out at the dark courtyard. "That, my dear Watson, is the crux of the problem. If we cannot find footprints on the ground, we must look for them elsewhere. Lady Clara mentioned seeing a shape near the roofline. And let us not forget the red stain on the threshold ink that was outside the door." He began to pace the room with feverish energy. "The ink is the key. Why would a thief, having successfully extracted a page through a roof vent or a ventilation shaft, leave a drop of ink on the exterior doorstep? It is a contradiction. A thief wants to remain invisible, yet this thief has left a signature in the most conspicuous place possible." "Perhaps it was an accident," I suggested. "In this case, Watson, there are no accidents, only carefully constructed illusions." Holmes suddenly stopped and turned to me, his eyes burning with a sudden realization. "The card game, Watson. The deck of cards Julian went to fetch. He was gone for 10 minutes. The manor is vast, but 10 minutes is a generous amount of time for a man who knows the secret passages of his own ancestral home. You think Julian used a passage? I think Julian is the distracted scholar he portrays, but I suspect the Lady Clara is the director of this particular play. Did you notice her gloves? She was hiding more than just the cold. She was hiding the stains of her own industry." Before I could press him further, a sharp cry echoed from the main house. It was a woman's voice, high, thin, and filled with a genuine primal terror. "The second act has begun," Holmes said grimly, snatching up his lantern. We raced back through the stone walkway, our footsteps echoing like drumbeats. We burst into the great hall to find the Earl standing at the base of the stairs, his face a mask of ashen horror. Above him, on the landing, Lady Clara stood clutching the banister, her lace gloves discarded on the floor. Her hands were visible no and they were stained a deep, dark crimson. "The shadow!" she gasped, pointing toward the upper gallery. "It was in my room." "It has taken the second page." Holmes did not look at her hands. He looked past her, toward the dark corridor that led to the servants' quarters. "Watson, stay with the Earl," he commanded. The phantom is no longer a shadow, it has found its flesh. He vanished into the gloom of the upper floor, leaving me with the trembling Earl and a woman whose hands appeared to be dripping with the very ink of the stolen gospel. Chapter 6. The blood of the saint, the great hall, was a cavern of shifting shadows, the flickering candlelight doing little to dispel the gloom that had settled over Morley Manor. Lady Clara stood on the landing like a tragic figure from a Grecian play, her hands held out before her as if she were trying to distance herself from her own skin. The blood of the saint, that vivid, terrifying cochineal ink dripped from her fingertips, spotting the white marble of the stairs. "Stay where you are, Lady Clara," I commanded, my medical instincts overriding my bewilderment. I bounded up the stairs, my bag swinging at my side. As I reached her, I took her wrists in my hands. The substance was thick, slightly tacky, and possessed that same pungent, vinegary odor of medieval pigment mixed with a hint of aniseed. There were no cuts, no abrasions. She was unhurt, yet she was trembling with such violence that I feared she might collapse. "It came from the darkness," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the open door of her boudoir. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that moved like the branches of a willow. It didn't speak. It simply reached for the desk where I had placed the leaf. "The leaf?" I asked, my heart hammering. "You had a page from the Gospel here, in your room." The Earl, having found his legs, stumbled up the stairs behind me. "Clara, what is the meaning of this? The manuscript was in the library." "I took it, Father," she cried, a sob breaking her voice. "I took the second Pageth martyrdom of St. Judah 3 days ago. I wanted to compare the gold work with my own sketches. I was afraid to tell you, and now it is gone. The phantom took it from under my very lamp." At that moment, the sound of a heavy door slamming echoed from the far end of the upper corridor. A moment later, Sherlock Holmes emerged from the shadows of the servants' wing. He was winded, his collar turned up, and his eyes were dancing with a fierce, cold light. In his hand, he held a small, crumpled piece of black silk. "The phantom is remarkably fleet of foot, Watson," he said, ignoring the Earl's gasps and Clara's tears, "and remarkably well acquainted with the attic crawl spaces of this manor." "Did you see him, Holmes?" I asked. "I saw a shadow that moved with the grace of a gymnast and the silence of a cat," Holmes replied. He walked over to Lady Clara and, with a gentleness that always surprised me, took one of her ink-stained hands in his. He examined the pattern of the stains with professional interest. "Tell me, Lady Clara, when this spirit took the page, did it touch you?" It brushed against my hands as I tried to pull the parchment away," she said, shuddering. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. He turned to the desk inside her room. The lamp was still burning, casting a pool of gold over a scattered mess of drawing materials. A single large drop of red ink sat in the center of a blank sheet of paper, but the ancient vellum page was nowhere to be seen. Holmes didn't look at the desk. He looked at the window. It was a heavy, leaded pane casement, currently shut and bolted from the inside. Outside, the snow continued its relentless, whispering descent. "The window is locked, the door was guarded by your own presence, and the chimney is far too narrow for a man," Holmes mused. "And yet, the thief entered, committed a robbery in the presence of a witness, and vanished. It is the library mystery repeated, but with a more personal touch. He suddenly stooped and picked up a small grey object from the rug. It was a pellet of some sort, no larger than a pea, and it smelled strongly of the same aniseed we had encountered in the library. "Julian!" the Earl roared. "Where is Julian?" "I am here, Uncle," a voice called out. Julian Pendergast appeared at the end of the hall, looking dishevelled, his waistcoat half unbuttoned. I heard the scream. "What has happened?" "Clary a hands." Holmes stepped between the cousins, his gaze flicking from one to the other like a rapier. "A most productive evening, wouldn't you say, Mr. Pendergast? 2 pages gone, a lady in hysterics, and a house full of footprints that exist only in the mind." "I don't know what you're implying, Holmes," Julian snapped, though he stepped back a pace. "I am implying nothing," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "I am stating that the whispering snow has a very distinct voice if one knows how to listen. Watson, I require your assistance. We must return to the library immediately. The 3rd act is about to begin, and I should be loath to miss the entrance of our principal performer." "But the thief is in the house, Holmes," I protested. "The thief is everywhere and nowhere, Watson, but the motive remains in the stone octagonal. Come, man, the game is afoot, and it is played on a board of ice." As we hurried back toward the courtyard, I looked at Holmes' profile. He looked less like a detective and more like a hunter who had finally caught the scent of his prey. The cozy warmth of Baker Street felt a world away here. In the heart of the blizzard, the blood of the saint had marked us all. Chapter 7. The Mechanic of the Macabre. The wind had risen to a rhythmic howl as we stepped back onto the covered stone walkway. The snow was no longer merely falling, it was a swirling horizontal dervish that threatened to erase the world beyond the manor walls. Holmes, however, seemed entirely immune to the elements. He held his lantern high, the light refracting through the crystalline air, casting long skeletal shadows against the library's octagonal stone. "You see it now, Watson, do you not?" he asked, his voice sharp with a sudden icy clarity. "I see a courtyard of untouched snow, Holmes, and a library that remains a fortress of impossibility," I replied, pulling my coat collar tighter. "If the thief did not walk and did not fly, then we are left with the supernaturala conclusion I know you find abhorrent. Abhorrent because it is a lazy man's refuge, Watson. When the impossible is eliminated, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And the truth in this case is not found on the ground, but in the geometry of the architecture." He led me to the very end of the walkway, where the stone roof of the passage joined the library wall. Above us, the eaves of the main manor loomed, separated from the library's roof by a gap of no more than 12 feet. "Look up, Watson." Not at the shadows, but at the icicles. I followed his gaze. The heavy icicles I had noticed earlier were peculiar. While most hung straight down, a cluster near the library's eastern ventilation slit was curved, as if a great heat or a physical force had warped them during their formation. "I need your shoulders, old friend," Holmes commanded. "The stone is slick, and I must examine the masonry near that slit." Despite my protesting joints, I braced myself against the freezing stone wall. Holmes, with the agility of a mountain goat, scrambled onto my shoulders. I felt him shifting, his fingers rasping against the mortar. "Aha!" he cried, the sound nearly lost to the wind. The spindly shadow reveals its skeleton. "Watson, catch this." Something small and heavy dropped into my gloved hand. It was a brass bobbin, wound with that same high-tension catgut I had seen earlier. Attached to it was a delicate, three-pronged iron hook, the tips of which were coated in a sticky, translucent resin. Holmes leaped down, landing silently in the snow at the very edge of the walkway, careful not to disturb the pristine drifts of the courtyard. "A fishing rod for history, Watson," he said, holding the bobbin to the lantern light. The thief did not need to enter the room. This device was lowered through the ventilation slit. The rhythmic scratching Miller heard was the hook scraping against the glass of the display case as the operator maneuvered it from the manor's roof. Once the case was hooked and eased open, a feat, made possible by the Earl's own neglect of the internal locks page, was snagged and retracted. "But the red ink, Holmes," I argued. "The stain on the threshold and the ink on Lady Clara's hands. How does a mechanical hook explain the presence of the pigment outside?" "The ink was the lure, Watson. Or rather, the medium of the theft's signature. The benediction of the lost was not simply stolen, it was extracted. The thief used a second line, weighted with a sponge soaked in cochineal ink and aniseed. The aniseed was to guide a small, trained creature, perhaps a marmoset, or a large rat through the ventilation system to help navigate the hook. But the creature was a distraction, a red herring for the senses. He began to pace the narrow walkway, his eyes flashing. The ink on the threshold was a marker, a drop intended to suggest a human presence where there was none. But the ink on Lady Clara's hands, that was a desperate improvisation. The second Pagath one she lost tonight was never in the library. She had it in her room, just as she said. The thief, realizing the game was being observed, used the manor's internal servants' bells and pulley system to move the phantom through the walls. "So Julian is the mechanic?" I asked. "Julian has the knowledge," Holmes mused, "but does he have the stomach? To operate such a device from a frozen roof in a blizzard requires a steady hand and a soul of iron. No, Watson, Julian is a pawn." He provided the aniseed and the scholarly cover. "But the hand that moved the hook, that hand is far more practiced in the art of deception." Holmes suddenly stopped and looked toward the manor's upper windows. A single light was burning in the attic rooms reserved for the lower servants and the storage of old trunks. "The mechanic of the macabre is currently cleaning his tools, Watson. And if I am not mistaken, he is preparing for the final movement of his symphony. The third page is the judgment of the world. It is kept in the Earl's private safe, not the library. The thief knows this. He has lured us to the library to keep us occupied while he strikes at the heart of the house. Then we must stop him." "We shall do better than that," Holmes said, a grim smile touching his lips. "We shall invite him to his own execution. But first, I must play a part I haven't attempted since the case of the Netherlands Sumatran. I require a disguise, a bit of shadows, and your service revolver." As we hurried back toward the main house, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The mystery was no longer a puzzle of snow and stone, it had become a hunt for a ghost that moved within the very walls that sheltered us. Chapter 8. The trap is set. The corridors of Morley Manor had grown even more treacherous than the frozen courtyard outside. The air within the house felt thick with suspicion, every flickering candle flame casting shadows that seemed to mock our progress. As we re-entered the great hall, Holmes' demeanor had shifted from the cold calculation of the investigator to the predatory stillness of a hunter. "Your service revolver, Watson," he said, his voice a low, commanding rasp. "Ensure it is loaded, but keep it in your pocket. I do not anticipate a gunfight, but our adversary is a man of singular ingenuity, and such men are often prone to desperate measures when cornered." I drew my Adams revolver, checked the cylindered brass of the cartridges gleaming dully in the light, and nodded. "It is ready, Holmes. But what of your disguise? You mentioned a part you haven't played in years." Holmes didn't answer immediately. He led me to a small secondary cloakroom behind the great staircase, a place filled with the heavy wool coats of the staff and the lingering scent of damp earth. With a speed that never failed to astonish me, he stripped off his deerstalker and heavy ulster. From the depths of a servant's locker, he procured a tattered dark grey duster and a soft felt cap. "The phantom, Watson, is a creature of the heights and the hollows," Holmes whispered, adjusting the cap so it shadowed his sharp features. He took a piece of charred wood from the nearby fireplace and, with a few deft strokes, altered the lines of his face, accentuating the hollows of his cheeks and darkening the area around his eyes. In the dim light, he no longer looked like the master of 221B Baker Street. He looked like a gaunt, skeletal wraither reflection of the very spindly shadow Miller had described. "Now," he continued, "the Earl's private study is situated directly beneath the attic storage. It contains the wall safe where the final page of the Gospel is kept. The thief knows that with the library and Lady Clara's room already plundered, the Earl will have checked his final treasure. By doing so, the Earl has inadvertently revealed the safe's exact location to anyone listening within the walls." "Listening within the walls?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "The servants' communication system, Watson. This manor is a labyrinth of copper wires and pull-pulleys. A man who understands the mechanics of the house can hear a whisper in the study from the rafters of the attic. He has been using the internal architecture as his own private gallery." We moved silently toward the Earl's study, a room lined with heavy crimson draperies and the oppressive weight of history. Holmes signaled for me to conceal myself behind a large tapestry depicting a medieval hunt, while he melted into the deep shadows beside the heavy oak desk. "Do not move, Watson," he breathed, "no matter what you hear. The mechanic works by rhythm and silence. We must allow him to believe he is the only ghost in the room." The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The only sound was the muffled moan of the blizzard against the stone and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I found myself counting the heartbeats, my hand tight upon the grip of my revolver. Then it began. It was not a footfall, but a sound so faint it might have been a dream. A dry, metallic hiss from somewhere above the ceiling. It was followed by the scratch-pause scratch that Miller had described. My eyes sought the ceiling, but in the gloom I could see nothing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a small circular panel in the ornate plasterwork of the ceiling designed for the hanging of a chandelier began to rotate. A thin, dark line descended through the opening. It was the catgut, shimmering like a spider's thread in the dying embers of the fire. At the end of the line was the mechanical device Holmes had described, the three-pronged iron hook moving with a terrifying lifelike autonomy. It swayed gently, as if sniffing the air, guided by some unseen hand in the darkness above. It drifted toward the painting of the first Earl Morleth portrait that, as we now knew, concealed the war safe. The hook tapped against the frame. Tink, tink. From the shadows, I saw the silhouette of Holmes rise, his movements perfectly synchronized with the swaying of the hook. He looked like a second shadow, a phantom pursuing a ghost. He did not reach for the hook. Instead, he reached for a small bell pull that hung near the desk cord for the very servant system the thief was utilizing. With a sudden, violent jerk, Holmes yanked the cord. The effect was instantaneous. A loud, discordant jangle erupted from the attic above, followed by a muffled cry of surprise and the sound of a heavy body hitting the floorboards. The mechanical hook jerked upward, its catgut line snapping under the sudden tension. "The trap is sprung, Watson," Holmes shouted, his voice ringing with triumph. "To the attic! We have the spider. Now we must secure the web." I burst from behind the tapestry, my revolver drawn, and followed Holmes as he sprinted toward the narrow hidden staircase that led to the servants' quarters. The silence of the house had been shattered, replaced by the frantic sounds of a man fleeing through the very walls he had sought to command. Chapter 9. The reveal in the rafters. The ascent to the attic was a journey through the skeletal anatomy of Morley Manor. We left the polished mahogany and warm hearths of the lower floors behind, climbing a narrow, spiraling staircase where the air grew thin, dusty, and bitingly cold. Holmes moved with a silent, feline grace, his lantern shuttered to a mere sliver of light. I followed, my heart thumping against my ribs, the weight of the revolver in my pocket a grim reminder of the stakes. The attic was a vast, sprawling forest of oak rafters and crossbeams, illuminated only by the occasional moonbeam piercing through a skylight. The floor was a treacherous patchwork of loose planks and exposed insulation. Scattered throughout were the heavy iron weights and tangled copper lines of the houses, bell-pull system very nerves of the manor that Holmes had so brilliantly subverted. "Careful, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible over the groaning of the timber. "The spider is wounded, but a spider in its own web is never to be trifled with." We rounded a massive brick chimney stack and came upon a sight that was as grotesque as it was ingenious. A small area of the attic had been cleared to form a makeshift workshop. On a low crate sat a collection of specialized tools, telescopic brass rods, miniature pulleys, and several jars of the pungent cochineal ink. But it was the occupant of the space that held my gaze. Slumped against a support beam, his leg tangled in a snarl of bell wires, was the man who had first appeared at Baker Street, Arthur Pendergast. He was no longer the trembling, frost-bitten messenger. His heavy greatcoat was off, revealing a lean, muscular frame dressed in tight-fitting black silk. His face, once pale with feigned terror, was now twisted in a snarl of exertion and pain. Beside him, trembling in a small wire cage, was a sleek brown ferret, its fur matted with a faint, yellowish oil that smelled strongly of aniseed. "Mr. Pendergast, I believe," Holmes said, stepping into the open and widening the aperture of his lantern. "Or should I say, Monsieur le Faucon, your work in the Musée d'Orsay was masterful, but you lacked the Victorian appreciation for a truly heavy blizzard." Pendergast let out a ragged laugh, reaching for a long, sharpened rod on the floor. "The snow, it was supposed to be my shield, Holmes. No footprints, no witness. I was a ghost." "You were a mechanic," Holmes countered, his eyes raking over the scene. "A ghost does not require a trained ferret to carry a silk thread through the ventilation pipes of a central heating system. A ghost does not need a telescopic rod to hook a manuscript page through a roof slit while balanced precariously on a frozen gutter." "But how?" I gasped, looking at the intricate web of wires. "The courtyard, Holmes." "He couldn't have reached the library without crossing the snow." "He never touched the snow, Watson," Holmes explained, never taking his eyes off our prisoner. "He utilized the roofline, by using the ferret to carry a lead line through the internal ventilation shafts guided by the car. A fanacida established a bridge between the attic of the manor and the ceiling of the library. Once the thread was through, he pulled a sturdier catgut line, followed by his mechanical fishing apparatus. He operated the entire theft from the safety of the roof, or this very attic, using the copper bell wires as a primitive remote control to manipulate the hook's lateral movement."
"And the ink?"
I asked. "The stain on the threshold." "A deliberate misdirection," Holmes said. He lowered a sponge to the doorstep to make us believe someone had stood there. "He wanted us to look for a man in a coat, not a line in the air. The ink on Lady Clara's hands was his only mistake. When he realized she had the second page in her room, he had to move quickly. He used the pulley system to drop into her room from the ceiling rose, but in the struggle, he spilled his own reservoir of pigment. Pendergast lunged then, his movements surprisingly swift despite his trapped leg, brandishing the sharpened rod like a rapier. I stepped forward, my revolver leveled, but Holmes was faster. With a sharp crack of his walking stick, he parried the blow and pinned the man's wrist against the beam. "The game is over, monsieur," Holmes said coldly. "The third Pagev judgment remains in the Earless safe. You tripped the very wires you sought to command. It is a poetic end for a man of your mechanical inclinations." As I moved to secure Pendergast's hands with my silk handkerchief, I looked at the ferret, which was now peacefully grooming itself in its cage. It was a domestic creature, a simple tool in a complex crime. The whispering snow was silent, Holmes, I remarked, but the house itself spoke against him. "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied, his intensity finally beginning to fade into that familiar post-case melancholy. "A house is a living thing. It does not like to be used as a thieving ground. Let us fetch Lestrade's local counterparts. I believe the Earl will find the benediction of the loss tucked inside Mr. Pendergast's black silk vest." Chapter 10. The philosophy of a frozen world, the arrival of the local constabulary, led by a huffing and remarkably frostbitten Inspector Forbes, brought a chaotic end to the silence of Morley Manor. The phantom of the rafters, now stripped of his black silk and revealed as the master thief known to Interpol as Le Faucon, was led away in irons, his feet crunching loudly on the very snow he had spent so much effort trying to preserve. In the warmth of the library, which now felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary, the Earl of Morley sat with the recovered pages of the Gospel of St. Jude spread before him. The benediction of the lost and the martyrdom of St. Jude had been returned to their rightful places within the vellum binding. The crimson stains on Lady Clara's hands had been washed away, though a faint pink hue remained around her cuticles, a lingering reminder of the night's terror. "I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Holmes," the Earl said, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "To think that an impostor could walk into my home, claim the name of a distant cousin, and use the very architecture of my ancestors to rob me. It is a chilling thought." "It was the perfect crime for a winter's night, Lord Morley," Holmes replied, standing by the fire and drying his damp coat. "Pendergast, or whatever his true name may be, realized that the blizzard provided a natural locked-room scenario. By ensuring no footprints were made, he forced the mind to leap toward the impossible. He banked on the fact that humans are inherently superstitious when faced with the silence of a storm." Lady Clara looked up from her tea. "And the aniseed, Mr. Holmes, and the poor creature in the attic." "The ferret was his most essential accomplice," Holmes explained. "Small, agile, and easily trained to follow a scent through the narrowest of conduits. By piping the scent of aniseed through the heating vents, he could guide the animal to exactly where he needed the guidelines to drop. It was a symphony of physics and biology, played out in the dark. We departed Morley Manor as the first light of dawn began to grey the eastern sky. The snow had finally stopped, leaving the world transformed into a pristine, glittering sculpture of white. The train journey back to London was a quiet one. Holmes spent the duration staring out at the passing fields, his long, thin fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern against the windowpane. It was not until we were back in the hallowed clutter of 221B Baker Street, with Mrs. Hudson's excellent ham and eggs steaming on the table, that the tension finally left my friend's frame. He sank into his armchair, the violin already in his lap, and looked at me with a tired but satisfied smile. "You know, Watson," he said, drawing a long melancholic note from the strings, "there is a certain purity in a case like this. Most crimes are born of the heat of passion, the red blood of anger, or the green bile of jealousy. But this was a crime of absolute zero. It was as cold and calculated as a mathematical equation. And yet," I remarked, stoking the fire, "it was the whispering snow that nearly defeated us. If you hadn't noticed that curved icicle or the smell of aniseed, we might still be looking for a ghost. Nature is never silent, Watson. She only speaks in a language we often forget to translate. The snow whispered the truth the moment it refused to show a footprint. It told us that the intruder was either a bird or a man who knew how to stay above the world." He began to play a slow, intricate piece by Bach, the music weaving through the blue clouds of his tobacco smoke. I sat back, watching the yellow fog of London begin to press against our windows, replacing the white drifts of Surrey. The cosy Victorian world had returned to its equilibrium, but I knew that beneath the surface of the city's bustle, other mysteries were already beginning to take shape. "A remarkable case, Holmes," I said, opening my journal to a fresh page. "I think I shall call it the mystery of the whispering snow." "Call it what you will, my dear doctor," Holmes replied, his eyes closing as the music took him. "As for me, I find that the most interesting thing about the snow is not how it covers the earth, but how quickly it vanishes when the sun rises. Like all our little dramas, Watson her for a moment, and then gone, leaving only the cold stone beneath." He fell silent then, the only sound in the room being the crackle of the hearth and the distant, reassuring clatter of a hansom cab on the cobbles below. The case was closed, the pages were restored, and for a few brief hours, Sherlock Holmes was at peace with the logic of the world. Chapter 11. The cipher of the palimpsest, the great Thor, arrived as suddenly as the frost had, turning London's white shroud into a dismal, grey slush that choked the gutters and splattered the ankles of every pedestrian. The whispering snow had lost its voice, replaced by the rhythmic drip-drip-drip of the eaves and the heavy, humid breath of a city returning to its soot-stained reality. At 221B Baker Street, the fire still burned, though the room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a laboratory. 3 days had passed since our return from Morley Manor. Arthur Pendergast de la Faucon remained in a cell at Newgate, awaiting the arrival of the French authorities. The case was, for all intents and purposes, a triumph. Yet, Sherlock Holmes was the picture of profound dissatisfaction. He had spent the better part of the morning hunched over a series of high-resolution photographs the Earl had sent us of the benediction of the lost. He had draped the room in a pungent, acrid scent of various chemical reagents. His long fingers stained a faint yellow from nitric acid. "You look like a man who has won the race but lost the prize, Holmes," I remarked, setting down the British Medical Journal. "The thief is caught. The pages are restored. What more can the whispering snow yield?" Holmes straightened his back, his spine cracking with the effort. He turned a photograph toward the light of the window. "A thief of Le Faucon's caliber, Watson, does not risk the gallows for a mere illumination. He is a man of logic, and logic dictates that the effort must be commensurate with the reward. The gold leaf on that page is worth perhaps £200. The risk he took, the mechanical complexity, the infiltration of a noble house was worth thousands. Perhaps he was commissioned by a private collector. A collector would want the whole book, not 2 disparate pages. No, Watson, there is a secondary narrative here. Look at the margins of the 9th century vellum." I rose and peered at the photograph. Beneath the swirling, intricate Celtic knots and the vibrant lapis lazuli of the illustrations, I saw nothing but the aged, slightly pitted texture of the calfskin. "I see only the work of the monks, Holmes, because you look, but you do not observe. This vellum is a palimpsest, Watson. Before it was the Gospel of St. Jude, it was something else. The monks scraped away the original text to save on parchment, but they did a hasty job. Under a specific spectrum of light, or when treated with a solution of hydrosulfate of ammonia, the ghost of the older text begins to speak." He picked up a small glass plate he had been working on. "I asked the Earl to allow a specialist from the British Museum to apply a cry, a non-destructive reagent, to the back of the second pageth one Lady Clara had in her possession. This is the result." The photograph he held was transformed. Faint, spindly Latin characters appeared to float beneath the gold leaf, like shadows beneath the ice of a pond. "It is a ledger," I whispered, following the lines. "Not a ledger, Watson. A map of coordinates. Specifically, coordinates relating to the Morley estate as it existed in the 17th century, during the height of the English Civil War. The Earl's ancestor was a staunch royalist who was rumoured to have hidden the family's Worcester fortune in silver and jewels before the Roundheads sacked the manor." I stared at him in amazement. Then the whispering snow was not just a description of the blizzard. It was a clue. Precisely. Subnivum suzerains whispering under the snow. It was the title of a poem found in the margins of the original text. Pendergast wasn't stealing art, he was stealing the key to a treasure that has been lost for over 200 years. He knew that the benediction page contained the latitude, and the martyrdom page contained the longitude. Together, they point to a specific spot in the courtyard, a spot that is only accessible when the ground is frozen hard enough to support the weight of a heavy stone lid without the earth shifting. "So that is why he needed the snow," I exclaimed. "Not just for cover, but for the physical conditions required to find the vault." Holmes nodded, a thin, triumphant smile finally crossing his lips. He had already found it, Watson. That crimson stain on the threshold? It wasn't just a misdirection. He was marking his starting point. If we hadn't interrupted his third act, he wouldn't have just stolen the third page. He would have vanished with the Morley fortune, leaving the Earl with a library full of books and a courtyard full of empty holes. A sharp knock at the door interrupted us. Billy, Holmes' young page, entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes ripped it open, his eyes flashing as he scanned the contents. "From the Earl," he said, tossing the paper to me. "Hole discovered beneath central pillar of library. Iron chest recovered. Your brains have saved more than my books. Eternal gratitude. Morley." Holmes picked up his violin and tucked it under his chin. "The treasure is safe, Watson. The history is preserved. And I am once again at the mercy of my own boredom." "Surely this discovery will make you the toast of London," I said. "I prefer the toast Mrs. Hudson provides," he replied, drawing a sharp, energetic chord. "Publicity is a fickle mistress, but a well-solved puzzle, that is the only mistress I have ever truly loved. Now, let us see if we can find something in the agony columns of the Times to occupy us, for the sun is coming out, and the world is becoming far too transparent for my liking." Chapter 12. The echo of the case a fortnight had passed since the bells of Morley Manor had rung out to celebrate the recovery of the Royalist silver. The great blizzard of '88 was now but a memory of frozen pipes and treacherous carriage rides, replaced by the familiar, damp embrace of a traditional London fog. The city had returned to its soot-grimed lungs, exhaling the yellow miasma that Holmes so often claimed was the only air a true detective could breathe. At 221B Baker Street, the Morning Post had brought a heavy wax-sealed package from the Earl. Inside was not merely a letter of thanks, but a singular token of gratitude. A small, exquisitely bound volume of the original Civil War ledgers found within the iron chest, accompanied by a modest but substantial cheque made out to Sherlock Holmes, Esq. Holmes, however, barely glanced at the draft. He was more interested in the ledger, turning the pages with a reverence he rarely showed for modern currency. "You see, Watson," he said, tapping the ancient parchment with his pipe stem, "the beauty of the Morley case was not in the silver or the jewels. It was in the layers. A 9th-century gospel shielding a 17th-century secret, all threatened by a 19th-century thief. It was a chronological sandwich, and we were the only ones with the appetite to digest it. I looked up from the manuscript I was preparing for the Strand magazine. It certainly has all the elements the public loves, Holmes. A ghost-like thief, a mechanical ferret, and a treasure buried beneath a blizzard. It is the very definition of a cosy mystery, despite the mortal danger." Holmes winced at the word cosy, his thin lips curling in a wry smile. "My dear Watson, there is nothing cosy about the breakdown of logic. To the Earl, it was a nightmare of the supernatural. To Pendergast, it was a high-stakes gamble against the laws of physics. Only to you, sitting by this fire with your pen and ink, does it become a pleasant diversion for the masses." He rose and paced the length of our sitting room, his shadow stretching long and thin against the bookshelves. He stopped at the window, peering out into the swirling grey gloom of Baker Street. "The French authorities have confirmed Pendergast's identity," he continued. "His real name is Henry Lefebvre, a disgraced engineer from Lyon who turned his genius for mechanics toward the illicit. He will spend the next 20 years reflecting on the friction coefficient of catgut and the unreliability of aniseed as a permanent guide. He was a worthy opponent, in his way. He understood that to fool the eyes, one must first confuse the mind." "And what of the Morley family?" I asked. The Earl seemed quite transformed by the discovery. "The Earl has promised to donate a portion of the treasure to the preservation of medieval manuscripts," Holmes replied. "A fitting penance for his previous neglect. Lady Clara has returned to her sketches, though I understand she now keeps her inkwells under lock and key. As for us, Watson—" He turned away from the window, his eyes regaining that restless, piercing glint that signaled the end of a period of stasis. "As for us," he repeated, "the world is moving on. The fog hides 1,000 petty cruelties and a dozen brilliant crimes. Even now, as we sit in the warmth of our memories, some poor soul is walking the docks of the East End with a secret that will eventually find its way to our door." "You wouldn't have it any other way," I said, closing my journal with a satisfying thud. "Perhaps not," Holmes mused. He picked up his violin and began to play a soft, haunting melody, a refrain that seemed to echo the lonely, whispering sound of the snow we had left behind in Surrey. But I find that as I grow older, I appreciate the silence more. The silence of a case closed. The silence of a truth revealed. The fire in the grate settled, a single coal popping and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. I watched my friend, the most singular man I have ever known, as he lost himself in the music. The whispering snow had been silenced, the treasure was unearthed, and for a few fleeting moments, The chaos of the world was held at bay by the walls of 221B. I reached for my pipe, content to sit in that companionable stillness. The fog might press against the glass, and the city might groan with its hidden sins, but inside there was the scent of tobacco, the warmth of the hearth, and the steady, unerring rhythm of the finest mind in Europe at rest. "A good case, Holmes," I whispered, though I doubt he heard me. He only nodded, his bow moving in a final, graceful arc as the echoes of the mystery faded into the soft Victorian night.